Egypt, 367 CE. The desert wind howls through the darkness as Brother Theodore stumbles across the rocky terrain, his sandals slipping on loose stones. His breathing is ragged, desperate. In his trembling hands, he clutches a leather satchel against his chest, like his life depends on it. Because honestly, it does. Behind him, maybe a mile back, torches pierce the Egyptian night. Imperial soldiers, sent by order of Archbishop Athanasius himself, are ransacking his monastery cell by cell, looking for forbidden books. Books that contain the secret teachings of Jesus Christ. Teachings so dangerous that possessing them is a death sentence. Theodore's mind races as he climbs toward the cliff overlooking the Nile. Just 3 months ago, life in the monastery was peaceful. They studied, they prayed, they copied manuscripts. Sure, some of their texts were unconventional, but they'd been reading these books for generations. The Apocryphon of John helped them understand the cosmic significance of Christ. The Gospel of Thomas challenged them to seek the divine spark within, and the Sophia of Jesus Christ, the wisdom of Jesus Christ, gave them profound insights into the nature of divine reality. But then came Athanasius's Easter letter. The Archbishop of Alexandria, in his infinite wisdom, had decided to clean house. 39 books would be considered canonical scripture. Everything else was heretical trash, to be burned immediately. No exceptions, no appeals. Theodore reaches the burial spot he scouted earlier. His hands shake as he pulls out the ceramic jar he prepared. 13 leather-bound codices. A treasure worth more than gold. Inside these books are conversations with the risen Christ that most Christians have never heard. Explanations of cosmic reality that make the universe itself seem like a symphony of divine love. Poetry so beautiful, it makes you weep. One by one, he places them in the jar. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, and there, wrapped carefully in linen, the Sophia of Jesus Christ. As he seals the jar, Theodore whispers a prayer that will echo across 16 centuries. Somehow, Lord, let someone find these. Let them understand what we were really thinking about, how we were trying to make sense of your cosmic glory. He buries the jar, covers it with rocks, and marks the spot with a simple cairn. Then Brother Theodore melts back into the desert darkness, leaving behind a treasure that will wait in absolute silence for over 1,600 years. Now, let me pause right here, because I can already hear some of you getting nervous. Oh no, here we go. Another story about how the early church suppressed the real Christianity. Another attack on biblical authority. Another attempt to undermine Orthodox faith. Hold on. Take a breath. Because what I'm about to tell you is going to blow your mind, and it's not going to threaten your faith. It's going to make you marvel at the intellectual sophistication of early Christian thinkers and the mysterious ways God works through human creativity. Fast forward to December 1945. Same patch of Egyptian desert, same Nile River in the distance. But now we meet Muhammad al-Saman, a local farmer digging for sabak, that natural fertilizer found in ancient ruins. His mattock strikes something hard. Not unusual around here, but this sound is different. Ceramic, hollow, big. Muhammad's heart races as he uncovers a large earthenware jar, sealed and undisturbed for who knows how long. Now here's where the story gets interesting, because Muhammad hesitates. In Egyptian folklore, sealed jars often contain jinns, evil spirits that have been trapped for centuries. Do you really want to be the guy who releases some ancient demon into the world? But Muhammad is also practical. His family is poor. Maybe there's gold in there, or silver, or at least something he can sell. So he raises his mattock high and brings it down hard, shattering the ancient seal that Theodore had placed so carefully all those centuries ago. Instead of gold, instead of demons, Muhammad finds something that will prove infinitely more valuable. 13 leather-bound books, their pages filled with ancient Coptic script. He has no idea what they say. He can't read Coptic. But even a poor farmer knows that really old books might be worth something to the right buyer. What Muhammad couldn't have known in that moment is that he'd just uncovered the Nag Hammadi Library, one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Christian history. And among those books was a text that would completely revolutionize how we understand the development of Christian theology. The books end up in the hands of scholars, and this is where our story really takes off. Because when Dr. Jean Dorès starts examining these texts in the 1950s, he notices something that makes his scholarly heart skip a beat. Two of the texts seem remarkably similar. Not just similar themes, but nearly identical passages, whole sections that match word for word. Picture Dorès in his office in Cairo, surrounded by ancient manuscripts and modern translations. He's got the Sophia of Jesus Christ open in front of him. This beautiful Christian text, where the resurrected Jesus teaches his disciples about the deepest mysteries of existence. And next to it, he's got another text called Eugnostos the Blessed, a philosophical treatise about divine reality and cosmic salvation. As he compares them line by line, passage by passage, Dorès starts to feel like a detective who's just cracked a cold case. The content isn't just similar, it's the same content, but presented differently. Where Eugnostos is written as a philosophical letter, the Sophia presents the same material as a post-resurrection dialogue between Jesus and his disciples. But here's where it gets really interesting. Eugnostos the Blessed appears to be the earlier text. It's not Christian at all. It's a sophisticated piece of Gnostic philosophy, probably written in the mid-2nd century. And the Sophia of Jesus Christ appears to be a Christian adaptation of this earlier work, created sometime in the late 2nd or early 3rd century. What this means is staggering. Some of the most profound Christian teaching attributed to the resurrected Jesus had actually been adapted from a pre-existing philosophical text. An anonymous Christian theologian had taken a complex Gnostic cosmology and brilliantly reframed it as the final teachings of Christ. Now I know what you're thinking. This sounds like fraud. This sounds like ancient plagiarism. This sounds like evidence that early Christianity was built on deception and intellectual theft. But hold on. Let me tell you why that's exactly the wrong way to think about this discovery. Because what we're looking at here isn't evidence of Christian deception. What we've discovered is evidence of the most brilliant kind of theological creativity imaginable. Think about the challenge facing educated Christians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. You've got this gospel message about a crucified Jewish carpenter who rose from the dead. You believe with all your heart that this Jesus is the key to understanding ultimate reality. But you're living in an intellectual environment dominated by sophisticated Greek philosophy. Your educated pagan neighbors want to know, how does your simple gospel story address the deep questions about the nature of existence? Questions like, how does the invisible, perfect divine realm relate to our imperfect material world? How did the universe come into being? What is the ultimate structure of reality? How can finite human beings achieve union with infinite divine truth? These aren't trivial questions. These are the questions that the greatest minds of antiquity spent their lives trying to answer. And if Christianity was going to be intellectually credible, it needed to provide sophisticated answers. Enter our anonymous Christian theologian. Let's call him Marcus, because someone this brilliant deserves a name, even if we don't know his real one. Marcus is probably an educated Egyptian Christian, trained in both Greek philosophy and Jewish scripture. He's deeply committed to the gospel, but he's also intellectually honest enough to recognize that Christianity needs to engage seriously with the philosophical challenges of his time. Now here's the key insight that changes everything about how we understand what Marcus did. Marcus doesn't see Greek philosophy as a threat to Christianity. He sees it as preparation for Christianity. He believes that the human mind, created in God's image, has been asking the right questions all along. The philosophers have been circling around truths that Christianity can now illuminate with perfect clarity. When Marcus encounters Eugnostos the Blessed, he doesn't see a competitor to Christian truth. He sees a tool that God has providentially prepared for Christian use. Here's a sophisticated philosophical text that maps out the structure of divine reality explains how spiritual and material worlds relate, and describes the path to salvation through knowledge. And it ends with a prophecy about a coming teacher who will reveal these truths with perfect clarity. Can you imagine the moment when Marcus realizes what he's discovered? Can you picture his excitement as he reads that final passage in Ugnostos, where the author tells his readers that everything he's taught them is just preparation for someone who will come in the future, someone who need not be taught, who will speak these truths with pure knowledge? This isn't just a useful philosophical text. This is a pre-Christian prophecy about the coming of Christ. This is God working through pagan philosophy to prepare the way for Christian revelation. This is providence in action. But now we need to pause and talk about the political situation that made Marcus's work so dangerous, because understanding the political context is crucial for appreciating why these texts ended up buried in the desert. Let me take you back to October 28th, 312 CE. Constantine is marching toward Rome to fight Maxentius for control of the Western Roman Empire. The night before the crucial Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine has a vision that will change the course of world history. He sees a cross of light in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Constantine wins the battle, attributes his victory to the Christian God, and begins the transformation of Christianity from a persecuted minority religion into the favored faith of the Roman Empire. At first, this seems like an unqualified blessing. Christians go from being fed to lions to being invited to imperial banquets. What could go wrong? Well, it turns out that imperial favor comes with imperial expectations. Constantine doesn't particularly care about the fine points of Christian theology, but he cares a lot about unity in his empire. Religious diversity looks like political instability. And unfortunately for people like Marcus, early Christianity in the 4th century is about as theologically diverse as you can imagine. You've got Christians in Egypt teaching cosmic Christologies that sound like they came out of Plato's academy. You've got Christians in Syria developing mystical practices that would make a Hindu guru jealous. You've got Christians in Rome trying to establish clear institutional authority. You've got Christians in North Africa debating whether spiritual purity is more important than church unity. From Constantine's perspective, this theological diversity is a nightmare. How can Christianity serve as a unifying force in the empire if Christians can't agree among themselves about basic doctrines? The solution, Constantine decides, is a church council. Gather all the bishops together, let them hash out their differences, establish a clear statement of orthodox Christian belief, and then enforce that orthodoxy throughout the empire. Simple, right? The Council of Nicaea convenes in 325 CE, and it's a fascinating study in the relationship between political power and theological truth. Picture nearly 300 bishops gathering in the imperial palace, many of them bearing the scars of the recent persecutions. These are men who have suffered for their faith. They deserve respect and careful consideration. But they're also operating under enormous political pressure. Constantine has made it clear that he expects them to reach consensus. The emperor is footing the bill for this council. He's providing security, accommodation, and transportation. He's also made it clear that he's not particularly interested in theological subtleties. He wants unity, and he wants it now. The council produces the Nicene Creed, and it's a masterpiece of theological precision. The careful language about Christ being begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father, represents genuine theological insight. These weren't just political compromises. These were Spirit-led Christians wrestling seriously with the mystery of the Incarnation. But here's the problem. Once you establish official orthodoxy, everything else becomes heresy by definition. Texts like the Sophia of Jesus Christ, which had once circulated freely among Christian communities, suddenly become dangerous contraband. Teachers like Marcus, who had once been respected for their theological creativity, become targets for investigation. The transformation happens with breathtaking speed. By 350 CE, just 25 years after Nicaea, possession of non-canonical Christian texts can result in exile, imprisonment, or worse. The imperial machinery that once persecuted Christians is now being used to persecute Christians who hold the wrong kinds of Christian beliefs. This is where the story gets truly heartbreaking, because we're not talking about wild heretics who had abandoned the gospel. We're talking about sincere Christians like the monks in Theodore's monastery who had been using texts like the Sophia of Jesus Christ for spiritual formation for generations. Imagine the conversations in Egyptian monasteries as reports of the imperial crackdown start filtering in. Picture the older monks who remember when theological diversity was celebrated rather than feared. They remember when texts like the Sophia of Jesus Christ were read openly in Christian gatherings. They remember the spiritual insights they gained from contemplating the cosmic Christ described in these books. But the younger monks are more practical. They point out the very real dangers. They've heard stories about monasteries being raided. They know about bishops who have been forced to sign loyalty oaths. They understand that the old theological freedom is gone, probably forever. The debate in Theodore's monastery is agonizing. Some argue for compliance. These are just books, they say. Our faith doesn't depend on possessing any particular text. Let's focus on what's truly essential and let the rest go. Others argue for resistance. These books contain profound spiritual wisdom, they insist. How can we be faithful Christians if we abandon insights that have nourished our souls for decades? But Theodore proposes something different, something that requires extraordinary courage and extraordinary faith. We can't save ourselves by possessing these books, he says to his brothers. But maybe we can save the books for future generations. Maybe God will raise up Christians in some future century who will be able to appreciate what we are being forced to abandon. It's a desperate plan, but it's also a plan that demonstrates remarkable confidence in divine providence. Theodore and his fellow monks are betting that God's truth is bigger than any particular historical moment. They are wagering that the intellectual insights preserved in texts like the Sophia of Jesus Christ will eventually find vindication, even if it takes centuries. The decision is made. 13 precious codices are carefully selected, wrapped in protective materials, and placed in a sealed ceramic jar. But this isn't just about preserving books. This is about preserving a vision of Christianity that embraces intellectual sophistication, theological creativity, and confidence in the cosmic significance of Christ. On that fateful night in 367 CE, Theodore carries the jar out into the desert, and with every step, he's carrying the hopes and dreams of Christians who believed that faith and reason, revelation and philosophy, spiritual truth and intellectual rigor could work together rather than against each other. As he buries the jar and covers it with stones, Theodore is performing one of the most important acts of theological preservation in Christian history. He's ensuring that future generations will have access to evidence of Christianity's intellectual golden age. He's guaranteeing that the story of Christian theological creativity won't be completely erased from history. But Theodore couldn't have imagined how long the wait would be. 1,678 years, nearly 17 centuries of silence, darkness, and waiting. Now let's fast forward to the moment when Muhammad al-Saman breaks open that jar in 1945, because what happens next is one of the most remarkable stories of archaeological discovery and scholarly detective work in modern history. The books initially end up in the hands of antiquities dealers in Cairo. Nobody quite knows what to make of them. They're obviously old, obviously important, but the Coptic script is difficult to read, and the content seems strange and unfamiliar. Eventually, some of the codices end up in the Coptic Museum in Cairo, others make their way to European collections, and scholars begin the painstaking work of translation and analysis. It's slow going. Coptic paleography is a specialized field. There aren't many scholars who can read 4th century Coptic script fluently. But as the translations begin to emerge in the 1950s and 1960s, the scholarly community starts to buzz with excitement. These aren't just random ancient texts. This is a library. a carefully curated collection of early Christian writings that had been completely lost to history. Dr. Jean Dorès is one of the first scholars to recognize the significance of what's been discovered. As he works through the translations of various texts, he starts to notice patterns, connections, relationships between different works in the collection. And then he encounters the Sophia of Jesus Christ, and everything clicks into place. Here's a Christian text where the resurrected Jesus appears to his disciples on a mountain in Galilee and teaches them about the deepest mysteries of existence. The cosmology is breathtakingly sophisticated. The theological insights are profound. The literary structure is elegant. But as Dorès continues working through the collection, he encounters another text, Eugnostos the Blessed. And as he begins comparing the two works, he realizes he's looking at one of the most remarkable examples of literary adaptation in ancient literature. Let me show you exactly what Marcus did, because when you see the specific editorial techniques he employed, you'll understand why this represents theological genius rather than intellectual theft. The opening of Eugnostos reads, Eugnostos the Blessed to those who are his. Greetings. I wish to inform you about the things that are above the world, since those who are from the race that is without a king have never known what these things are. The opening of the Sophia of Jesus Christ reads, After he rose from the dead, when his 12 disciples and 7 women who had been following him as disciples were all together, doubting about the underlying reality of the universe and the plan of salvation and the holy providence and the power of the authorities and everything that the Savior had told them about the mystery of the holy plan, the Savior appeared to them not in his previous form, but in an invisible spirit. Do you see what Marcus has done? Where Eugnostos presents abstract philosophical instruction in the form of a letter, Marcus transforms the same content into a post-resurrection dialogue. Where Eugnostos addresses a general audience seeking spiritual knowledge, Marcus specifies that the audience is the 12 disciples and 7 women followers of Jesus. But the real brilliance becomes apparent when you compare the actual content. Here's a passage from Eugnostos describing the primordial divine realm. The immortal human appeared, one who is androgynous. His male name is Perfect Mind, and his female name is All-Wise Begetress Sophia. It is also said that she resembles her brother and her consort, the one whose name is First Begetter Son of God. The whole multitude of immortals call him the silent, perfect First Father. Now here's the corresponding passage from the Sophia of Jesus Christ, where Marcus puts these same words into the mouth of Jesus. The Savior said to them, I want you to know that all humans who have been born on earth from the foundation of the world until now, being dust, have inquired about God, who he is and what he is like, but have not found him. Now the wisest among them have speculated about the ordering of the world and its movement. But their speculation has not reached the truth. The ordering is spoken of in 3 opinions by all the philosophers, and hence they do not agree. For some of them say about the world that it was directed by itself. Others say that it is providence that directs it. Others say that it is fate. But it is none of these. The immortal human appeared, one who is androgynous. Can you see the editorial brilliance here? Marcus takes the cosmological content from Eugnostos and embeds it within a Christian framework that addresses the relationship between philosophical speculation and Christian revelation. He shows Jesus acknowledging the value of philosophical inquiry while demonstrating that Christian revelation provides the ultimate answers to the questions that philosophers have been asking. This isn't plagiarism. This is theological interpretation of the highest order. Marcus is demonstrating that the cosmic truths that philosophers discovered through reason find their perfect fulfillment in Christian revelation. He's showing that Jesus, as the eternal Logos, is indeed the key to understanding the ultimate structure of reality. But Marcus doesn't just copy and paste. He makes crucial adaptations that reveal deep theological thinking. Where Eugnostos presents the divine realm as populated by androgynous spiritual beings, Marcus is careful to maintain monotheistic sensibilities while still acknowledging the complexity of divine reality. Where Eugnostos describes salvation as a purely intellectual process, Marcus emphasizes that true knowledge comes through relationship with Christ. The structural transformation is equally sophisticated. Eugnostos presents philosophical truth as the conclusion of human reasoning. The Sophia of Jesus Christ presents the same truths as divine revelation that transcends human reasoning while still engaging with it seriously. This is exactly what the best Christian theology has always done. Think about how the Gospel of John uses logos philosophy to explain the incarnation. Think about how Paul adapts Stoic ethical categories for Christian discipleship. Think about how Augustine incorporates Platonic metaphysics into Christian systematic theology. Marcus is working within a well-established tradition of Christian intellectual adaptation. He's demonstrating that Christianity doesn't need to fear philosophical sophistication. Rather, Christianity proves its divine origin by its ability to engage with and ultimately transcend every form of human wisdom. But while Marcus is creating this theological masterpiece, storm clouds are gathering on the horizon, because not everyone in the Christian community appreciates this kind of theological creativity. Let me introduce you to Irenaeus of Lyons, a man who represents everything that was both valuable and limiting about the Orthodox response to theological diversity. Irenaeus was born around 130 CE, probably in Asia Minor. He lived through the period of rapid Christian expansion and witnessed firsthand the theological diversity that characterized second-century Christianity. Irenaeus was genuinely concerned about the unity and stability of the Christian movement. He saw teachers like Marcus as dangerous innovators who were leading Christians away from the simple gospel truth that the apostles had delivered to the church. He was particularly worried about Gnostic teachers who seemed to be creating elaborate theological systems that had little connection to the historical Jesus of the New Testament. In his massive work against heresies, Irenaeus writes, "These men falsify the oracles of God and prove themselves evil interpreters of the good word of revelation. They also overthrow the faith of many by drawing them away, under a pretense of superior knowledge from him who rounded and adorned the universe, as if they had something more excellent and sublime to reveal than that God who created the heaven and the earth and all things that are therein." Now, Irenaeus isn't wrong to be concerned about theological innovation that loses touch with apostolic tradition. There were indeed teachers in the 2nd century who created speculative systems that seemed to have little connection to the historical revelation in Jesus Christ. But the tragedy is that Irenaeus couldn't distinguish between theological creativity that served Christian truth and theological speculation that obscured Christian truth. When he looked at teachers like Marcus, he saw dangerous innovators rather than brilliant interpreters. The conflict between these two approaches to Christianity, Marcus' confident intellectual engagement versus Irenaeus' cautious boundary maintenance, represents one of the great tensions in Christian intellectual history. And unfortunately, when Christianity gained political power in the 4th century, the Irenaean approach won decisively. Archbishop Athanasius of Alexandria, the man whose Easter letter triggered the burial of the Nag Hammadi texts, was a direct intellectual descendant of Irenaeus. Athanasius was a brilliant theologian in his own right, and his contributions to Christological doctrine were genuinely important. But he also represented a Christianity that was increasingly suspicious of theological diversity and intellectual creativity. When Athanasius issued his famous Easter letter in 367 CE, establishing the 27-book New Testament canon and condemning all other Christian texts as heretical forgeries, he was drawing a line in the sand. From now on, he was saying, Christianity would be defined by adherence to specific approved texts rather than by participation in ongoing theological conversation. The monks in Theodore's monastery understood what this meant. The intellectual golden age of Christianity was over. the period when brilliant minds like Marcus could engage creatively with the philosophical resources of their time, confident that Christian truth was robust enough to benefit from such engagement, was ending. But here's what Athanasius couldn't have foreseen, what none of the 4th century heresy hunters could have imagined. By suppressing texts like the Sophia of Jesus Christ, they weren't eliminating dangerous ideas. They were depriving future generations of Christians of evidence of the intellectual sophistication that had once characterized their tradition. The Christianity that survived the 4th century consolidation was more unified, more institutionally stable, and more politically viable than the diverse Christianity of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. But it was also more intellectually timid, more suspicious of philosophical engagement, and more concerned with maintaining boundaries than exploring possibilities. The burial of the Nag Hammadi texts represents the end of one chapter in Christian intellectual history and the beginning of another. Theodore and his fellow monks were preserving evidence of what Christianity had been, hoping that someday future generations would rediscover what Christianity could be again. And this brings us to one of the most remarkable aspects of our story, because the preservation of these texts required an underground network of extraordinary sophistication and courage. You have to understand that by the mid-4th century, Egyptian monasticism had developed into a complex network of communities spread across the desert regions of Upper Egypt. These weren't isolated hermitages. These were interconnected communities that maintained regular communication and shared resources. The Pachomian monasteries, in particular, had developed sophisticated systems for manuscript copying and distribution. Each major monastery had its own scriptorium, where scribes worked to preserve and disseminate Christian texts. They had established procedures for quality control, systems for coordinating copying projects across multiple communities, and networks for sharing rare or difficult-to-obtain texts. When the imperial crackdown began, these networks became clandestine preservation operations. Monks developed coded language for communicating about dangerous texts. They established secret hiding places in caves and buried caches in the desert. They created systems for rapidly moving compromising materials between monasteries when imperial investigators were in the area. The decision to bury the Nag Hammadi collection wasn't made by Theodore alone. It was the result of careful consultation among several monastic communities. They had to decide which texts were most important to preserve. They had to coordinate the selection process to avoid unnecessary duplication. They had to choose burial sites that would be secure, but also potentially recoverable. Picture the clandestine meetings in desert caves as the monks planned their preservation strategy. These men were risking their lives to save books. They were choosing intellectual heritage over personal safety. They were betting that truth would ultimately prevail over political pressure. Brother Theodore's midnight journey to the burial site was the culmination of months of careful planning and preparation. The ceramic jar had been specially made and tested for long-term preservation. The texts had been carefully selected to represent the breadth of early Christian theological diversity. The burial location had been chosen for both security and potential future accessibility. As Theodore sealed the jar and covered it with stones, he was performing the final act in one of history's most sophisticated information preservation operations. These monks understood that they were living through a pivotal moment in Christian intellectual history. They recognized that the theological diversity they had known was about to be lost, probably forever. But they also maintained hope that divine providence would somehow ensure the survival and eventual vindication of the traditions they were being forced to abandon. Theodore's prayer over the buried texts wasn't just a request for preservation. It was an act of faith in God's commitment to truth, an expression of confidence that intellectual honesty and spiritual devotion would ultimately prove compatible rather than contradictory. The jar sat in the desert for 1,678 years through the rise and fall of Islamic empires through the Crusades. through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment, through 2 world wars, waiting for the right moment to emerge back into human consciousness. And when Muhammad al-Saman finally broke open that ancient seal in 1945, he wasn't just discovering old books. He was releasing back into the world a vision of Christianity that had been forced underground for over 16 centuries. The scholarly work that followed the discovery represents one of the most remarkable detective stories in the history of religious studies. When scholars like Jean Dorès, Henri Charles Puech, Gilles Kipel, and others began working through the translations, they weren't just deciphering ancient texts. They were reconstructing an entire lost chapter in Christian intellectual history. The recognition that the Sophia of Jesus Christ was based on Eugnostos the Blessed was just the beginning. As scholars continued to analyze the relationships between various texts in the collection, they began to map out networks of literary dependence and theological influence that revealed the complexity of early Christian intellectual development. They discovered that many of the texts in the collection were related to each other in sophisticated ways. Some shared common sources. Others represented different stages in the development of particular theological traditions. Still others showed evidence of cross-pollination between different Christian communities. But the most remarkable discovery was the evidence these texts provided of the intellectual sophistication that had once characterized Christianity. The theological creativity, the philosophical sophistication, the literary artistry, the spiritual depth, all of this had been part of the Christian tradition before the 4th century consolidation. Dr. Bentley Layton of Yale University, one of the leading scholars of the Nag Hammadi collection, later wrote, "The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library has fundamentally changed our understanding of early Christianity. These texts reveal a religious movement that was far more intellectually diverse, theologically creative, and philosophically sophisticated than we had previously imagined. But here's what makes this discovery so remarkable from a Christian perspective. The recovery of texts, like the Sophia of Jesus Christ, doesn't undermine Orthodox Christianity. It enriches it. It shows us that the intellectual tradition we've inherited has deeper roots and broader possibilities than we realized. When we study Marcus's adaptation of Eugnostos, we're not discovering evidence of Christian fraud or theological confusion. We're witnessing the work of a brilliant Christian mind engaged in the kind of intellectual creativity that should inspire Christians in every generation. Marcus understood something that every Christian theologian needs to understand. The gospel doesn't require us to abandon intellectual sophistication. Rather, intellectual sophistication, properly employed, serves the gospel by demonstrating the cosmic significance of Christian truth. The cosmology that Marcus presents in the Sophia of Jesus Christ is breathtakingly beautiful. He describes a divine realm that unfolds through progressive emanation from the invisible Father, through the immortal human, through various levels of spiritual beings, ultimately resulting in the creation of the material universe. But this isn't just abstract speculation. Marcus shows how this cosmic structure explains the significance of the Incarnation. Jesus Christ, as the divine Logos, bridges the gap between the invisible spiritual realm and the material world. He reveals the hidden connections that make redemption possible. The spiritual psychology that Marcus develops is equally sophisticated. He explains how human beings, created in the divine image, contain within themselves the capacity for union with ultimate reality. But this capacity can only be actualized through knowledge of the cosmic truth that Christ reveals. The soteriological vision that Marcus presents combines mystical insight with practical spirituality. Salvation isn't just about moral improvement or future reward. It's about cosmic transformation, about coming to understand your place in the ultimate structure of reality, about achieving union with the divine source from which you originally came. This is theology of the highest order, presented with literary artistry and spiritual depth that rivals anything in later Christian tradition. And the fact that it was created through adaptation of pre-existing philosophical material doesn't diminish its value. It demonstrates the theological creativity that produced it. But we need to be clear about what this discovery means for contemporary Christianity, because I know some of you are wondering whether this validates Gnostic Christianity or undermines biblical authority or suggests that Orthodox doctrine is just one option among many. Let me be very clear. The discovery of the Sophia of Jesus Christ doesn't prove that Gnostic Christianity is superior to Orthodox Christianity. It doesn't invalidate the decisions made at the Council of Nicaea. It doesn't suggest that the New Testament canon is arbitrary or mistaken. What it does prove is that early Christianity was intellectually richer and more diverse than we previously understood. It shows us that the process by which Christian doctrine developed was more complex and more interesting than simple models of apostolic succession suggest. Most importantly, it reveals that Christian truth is robust enough to engage with any philosophical challenge, sophisticated enough to incorporate insights from any intellectual tradition, and confident enough in its divine origin to demonstrate its superiority through intellectual excellence rather than institutional suppression. This should encourage rather than threaten contemporary Christians. The discovery of the Sophia of Jesus Christ shows us that our tradition has always been capable of the kind of intellectual creativity that Marcus demonstrated. It proves that Christianity thrives when it engages confidently with the best thinking of its time, rather than retreating into defensive isolation. Think about what this means for how we read the Bible today. When we encounter passages in Paul that seem to reflect Stoic philosophical influence, we don't conclude that Paul was confused about Christian truth. We recognize that Paul was brilliant enough to use philosophical concepts that served his evangelical purposes. When we read the Gospel of John and notice how it employs logos theology to explain the incarnation, we don't worry that John was compromising the gospel with Greek speculation. We appreciate the theological sophistication that enabled John to communicate Christian truth in categories that his educated readers could understand. The same principle applies to Marcus's adaptation of eugnostos. When we recognize that the Sophia of Jesus Christ incorporates pre-existing philosophical material, we shouldn't conclude that Marcus was deceiving his readers or abandoning Christian truth. We should appreciate the intellectual courage that enabled him to demonstrate the cosmic significance of Christ using the best philosophical resources available in his time. This discovery also has profound implications for how we think about the development of Christian doctrine. The traditional model suggests that authentic Christian teaching flows directly from apostolic tradition through unbroken chains of succession. Anything that deviates from this apostolic deposit is automatically suspect. But the Sophia of Jesus Christ shows us that authentic Christian teaching has always emerged through creative engagement between apostolic tradition and contemporary intellectual challenges. The process is more dynamic, more creative, and more intellectually adventurous than simple preservation models suggest. This doesn't mean that anything goes in Christian theology. It means that Christian truth is living truth that grows and develops as each generation of Christians brings their questions and insights to the encounter with divine revelation. The early church fathers who developed the doctrine of the Trinity were doing exactly what Marcus did when he adapted eugnostos. They were taking philosophical concepts that hadn't originally been designed for Christian use and demonstrating how these concepts could serve Christian truth. When Athanasius argued that the Son is homoousios, of one substance, with the Father, he was employing Greek philosophical categories to explain a Christian theological insight. When the Cappadocian Fathers distinguished between ousia and hypostasis in their Trinitarian theology, they were adapting philosophical terminology for Christian doctrinal purposes. The difference between orthodox theological development and the kind of theological creativity that Marcus represented isn't that one involved adaptation and the other didn't. The difference is that orthodox development took place within institutional structures that provided accountability and communal discernment, while teachers like Marcus were working in more isolated contexts with less systematic oversight. But this doesn't mean that Marcus's theological creativity was invalid or dangerous. It means that the church needed to develop better ways of incorporating theological creativity within structures of communal discernment and institutional accountability. The tragedy of the 4th century consolidation isn't that the church established orthodox doctrine. The tragedy is that in establishing orthodoxy, the church lost appreciation for the kind of theological adventurousness that had once been a source of strength rather than a threat to unity. What we're learning from the rediscovery of texts like the Sophia of Jesus Christ is that the church can embrace both doctrinal stability and theological creativity. We can maintain clear commitments to apostolic tradition while still encouraging the kind of intellectual engagement that Marcus represented. Modern Christianity needs both the stability that Athanasius provided and the intellectual courage that Marcus demonstrated. We need institutional structures that preserve essential Christian truths, but we also need intellectual freedom that allows each generation to explore the contemporary implications of those truths. The buried texts of Nag Hammadi have been recovered not to replace Orthodox Christianity, but to enrich it. They provide us with models of theological creativity that can inspire contemporary Christian thinking. They show us possibilities for intellectual engagement that we can adapt for our own cultural context. But we also need to be honest about why these texts were suppressed, and why that suppression, while tragic in many ways, may have been necessary for the survival of the Christian movement in the 4th century. The Roman Empire in the 4th century was facing enormous challenges: political instability, economic crisis, military pressure from barbarian tribes, social upheaval. The empire needed unifying institutions to survive. A Christianity that could serve as a source of social cohesion was politically valuable. A Christianity that was too diverse to provide clear social direction was politically problematic. Constantine's support for Christianity was genuine, but it was also pragmatic. He needed a religion that could help hold his empire together. A Christianity that spent most of its energy debating complex theological questions wasn't going to serve that function effectively. The bishops who participated in the Council of Nicaea understood this political reality. They recognized that excessive theological diversity was becoming a threat not just to church unity, but to the survival of the Christian movement in a hostile world. From their perspective, teachers like Marcus represented a luxury that the church could no longer afford. However brilliant his theological creativity might be, however profound his spiritual insights might be, Marcus's approach to Christianity was producing division rather than unity, confusion rather than clarity, intellectual sophistication rather than missionary effectiveness. The decision to suppress alternative Christian voices like Marcus wasn't made lightly or maliciously. It was a tragic choice made by sincere Christians who believed that the survival of the gospel required institutional uniformity rather than intellectual diversity. And in many ways, they were right. The unified Christianity that emerged from the 4th century consolidation proved remarkably successful at preserving Christian truth through the collapse of the Roman Empire, the rise of Islam, the barbarian invasions, and the intellectual challenges of later centuries. But they also paid a price for this survival strategy. The Christianity that survived was more institutionally stable but less intellectually adventurous. It was more unified but less creative. It was more successful at preserving essential truths but less capable of exploring their contemporary implications. The rediscovery of texts, like the Sophia of Jesus Christ, gives us an opportunity to reclaim some of what was lost in the 4th century consolidation without abandoning what was gained. We can appreciate the theological creativity that Marcus represented while still maintaining commitment to the doctrinal stability that Orthodox Christianity provides. This is particularly important for contemporary Christianity because we're facing intellectual challenges that are at least as complex as those that confronted Marcus in the 2nd century. Questions about the relationship between religious faith and scientific discovery, between Christian truth and religious pluralism, between ancient revelation and contemporary moral insight, between institutional authority and individual conscience. These questions require the kind of intellectual courage that Marcus demonstrated. They require Christians who are confident enough in the gospel to engage seriously with contemporary philosophical challenges, sophisticated enough to adapt new insights for Christian purposes, and creative enough to demonstrate the contemporary relevance of ancient truths. The Sophia of Jesus Christ provides us with a model for this kind of intellectual engagement. It shows us what it looks like when a brilliant Christian mind takes the best philosophical insights available in his time and demonstrates how they point toward Christ. But it also reminds us that this kind of theological creativity requires communal discernment and institutional accountability. Marcus's work was brilliant, but it was also isolated. He didn't have the benefit of sustained dialogue with other Christian theologians. He didn't work within structures that could provide ongoing evaluation and correction. Contemporary Christians who want to follow Marcus's example need to learn from both his successes and his limitations. We need the intellectual courage to engage with contemporary philosophical challenges, but we also need the institutional wisdom to ensure that our theological creativity serves rather than obscures the gospel. This brings us back to Brother Theodore and his remarkable act of preservation. When Theodore buried those texts in the Egyptian desert, he wasn't just trying to save books from destruction. He was preserving a vision of Christianity that embraced intellectual sophistication as a tool for spiritual insight rather than a threat to faith commitment. Theodore understood that the theological creativity represented by texts like the Sophia of Jesus Christ was part of Christianity's spiritual heritage. He believed that future generations of Christians would benefit from exposure to this kind of intellectual adventurousness, even if his own generation found it too dangerous to tolerate. The recovery of the Nag Hammadi texts 16 centuries later proves that Theodore's faith was justified. God did indeed preserve these texts for future generations. Divine providence did ensure that evidence of early Christian intellectual sophistication would eventually be restored to the Church. But the preservation and recovery of these texts is just the beginning of the story. The real question is, what contemporary Christians will do with this recovered heritage? Will we approach these texts with the same intellectual courage that Marcus demonstrated in creating them? Will we allow them to inspire new forms of theological creativity adapted to our contemporary challenges? Or will we treat them simply as historical curiosities, interesting examples of ancient speculation that have no relevance for contemporary Christian faith and practice? The answer to this question will determine whether the recovery of texts like the Sophia of Jesus Christ represents a genuine renaissance in Christian intellectual life or just an academic footnote in the history of early Christianity. I want to suggest that we have an opportunity, perhaps a responsibility, to learn from both Marcus's intellectual courage and the limitations that led to his suppression. We can embrace the kind of theological creativity that he represented while still maintaining the institutional accountability that his work lacked. This means taking seriously the philosophical challenges of our own time and demonstrating how Christian truth illuminates rather than obscures them. It means being confident enough in the gospel to engage with insights from science, philosophy, psychology, sociology, and other disciplines, showing how these insights can serve Christian truth rather than threaten it. It means being creative enough to adapt new intellectual tools for Christian purposes while still maintaining clear connections to apostolic tradition and biblical revelation. It means having the theological sophistication to demonstrate that Christianity is not only compatible with intellectual excellence, but actually requires it. Most importantly, it means recognizing that the same Spirit who inspired the biblical authors, who guided the early church fathers, who preserved the Nag Hammadi texts through centuries of suppression, is still at work today, still revealing new dimensions of divine truth through human intellectual effort. The story of the Sophia of Jesus Christ reminds us that Christianity has always been a conversation between divine revelation and human understanding. The faith once delivered to the saints grows and develops, as each generation brings their questions and insights to the encounter with God's self-disclosure in Jesus Christ. Marcus understood this. Theodore understood this when he risked his life to preserve evidence of this understanding. The scholars who have worked to recover and interpret the Nag Hammadi texts understand this. They are all participants in the same ongoing dialogue between ancient truth and contemporary insight that has always characterized authentic Christian intellectual life, and you're invited to be part of this conversation. You don't need to become a professional theologian or a specialist in ancient texts to participate in the kind of intellectual adventure that the Sophia of Jesus Christ represents. You can approach your Bible reading with the same confidence that Christianity can handle sophisticated questions that Marcus brought to his theological work. You can engage with contemporary culture with the same assurance that Christian truth has the resources to illuminate every dimension of human experience. You can embrace the intellectual challenges of discipleship rather than avoiding them. You can trust that the same God who worked through Marcus's theological creativity, who preserved Theodore's buried texts, who guided the modern recovery of the Nag Hammadi library, is still working to reveal divine truth through human intellectual effort. The adventure continues. The conversation between divine revelation and human understanding is far from over. The kind of theological creativity that produced the Sophia of Jesus Christ is still needed, still possible, still part of what it means to be a faithful Christian in whatever cultural context we find ourselves. Brother Theodore's prayer over those buried texts has been answered. The intellectual courage that he preserved has been restored to the church. The question now is whether we'll have the wisdom to use this recovered heritage in ways that serve the gospel rather than obscure it. The same Christ who appeared to his disciples in the Sophia of Jesus Christ, teaching them about the cosmic significance of his incarnation and the ultimate structure of divine reality, is still appearing to disciples today, still teaching us about the profound connections between spiritual truth and intellectual understanding. The wisdom of Jesus Christ isn't locked in ancient texts. It's a living reality that continues to illuminate the deepest questions of human existence for anyone courageous enough to seek it, sophisticated enough to understand it, and faithful enough to follow wherever it leads. This is our heritage. This is our calling. This is the adventure of Christian intellectual life that the story of the Sophia of Jesus Christ invites us to embrace. The conversation continues, and your voice is part of it.